At the moment Allied forces broke onto the beaches of Normandy, the German defensive structure reacted faster than the leadership designed to control it. Coastal radar sites reported an unprecedented concentration of ships in the channel. Batteries along Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword sent urgent signals that landing craft were approaching in dense formations. Paratrooper sightings appeared across the Cotentin and Caen sectors, confirming a coordinated assault. Infantry regiments, overwhelmed by naval gunfire, transmitted fragmented but unmistakable messages. This was no small raid. Everything in the German system pointed to a full invasion, except the man whose authority was required to release the armored reserves. Hitler was asleep at the Berghof, and the strict protocol surrounding his schedule made awakening him a politically dangerous act. Officers feared being blamed for unnecessary alarm. Others believed the weather reports, which claimed no major landing was likely. The delay created a strategic vacuum. In the field, commanders recognized that the scale of the operation exceeded all prior Allied probes. Reports described destroyers firing so close to shore that German gun crews could see the flash of their guns, while thousands of troops advanced under the cover of smoke and bombardment. The request for armored intervention repeated across multiple sectors, but no division could move without Hitler's direct approval. When he was finally briefed, his first response shaped the German reaction for hours. The attack in Normandy is a diversion. He insisted the real invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais, repeating assumptions reinforced by months of Allied deception. False radio networks, phantom divisions, and staged reconnaissance. Every signal the Allies had planted pointed to Calais. Even with concrete evidence of mass landings, Hitler applied the same conclusion. Normandy was not the decisive blow. His disbelief collided with the reality unfolding along the coast. While coastal divisions fought with inadequate firepower, while airborne troops seized causeways and bridges, and while Allied engineers cleared beach obstacles, the Panzer divisions, Germany's only hope for throwing the Allies back into the sea, remained idle behind the lines. The system built around Hitler amplified hesitation. Regional commands waited for confirmation. Corps headquarters delayed issuing counterattack orders. Tank battalions remained dispersed to avoid air attack, unable to concentrate without explicit instructions. By the time Hitler agreed to release part of the reserves, the beachheads were already consolidating. His first words mattered not only for what they expressed, but for what they prevented, a timely counterstroke that could have struck the Allies before they secured their foothold. The German command structure had been engineered so that one man's belief could override every field report, and on the morning of the invasion, that belief aligned perfectly with Allied deception. The reaction across German headquarters reflected a structural problem created long before the first landing craft touched the beaches. Hitler had centralized authority for armored deployments so tightly that even army group commanders could not move a single panzer battalion without his approval. This design, meant to prevent independent action and ensure absolute control, now produced paralysis at the exact moment. Speed was essential. Reports pouring into the regional commands were unambiguous. Multiple beach sectors under assault. Airborne forces identified in depth. Naval bombardments silencing coastal guns. Yet every officer responsible for counteraction was constrained by a command system that required decisions to flow upward rather than outward. Corps and divisional staffs reviewed defensive plans, outlined contingencies, and prepared attack routes, but none could execute them. Field Marshal Rundstedt, overseeing the Western Front, pressed for immediate use of the armored reserves stationed closest to the invasion zone. Rommel, whose own inspection tour had taken him away from Normandy that morning, had argued for forward-positioned tanks able to strike the Allies directly on the beaches. But strategic disagreements from previous months had left the reserves divided between dispersed defensive roles and centralized control, an arrangement that satisfied no one and weakened everyone. As messages intensified, a pattern emerged. Units reported breakthroughs, then silence. Batteries that had signaled enemy landings ceased transmitting after sustained naval fire. Infantry companies attempted to regroup but found their command links severed by paratrooper actions inland. Signals officers tried to reestablish communication, but faced interference from Allied jamming and the destruction of relay stations. Each headquarters up the chain anticipated an order that never arrived. Panzerlehr, positioned inland, maintained readiness but stayed fixed. The 12th SS, eager to move, awaited written authorization. The 21st Panzer Division, partially within striking distance, received contradictory instructions: advance, hold, reposition, await confirmation. Every conflicting command traced back to uncertainty at the top. The Allies had counted on this. Their deception plan had not simply fed false information, it exploited the German decision-making structure itself. By reinforcing the expectation of a Calais landing, they ensured that Hitler would hesitate at the critical moment. The German defensive network, rigid, centralized, and dependent on one man's interpretation, could not adapt quickly enough to the reality unfolding along the Norman coast inside German operations rooms. Officers concentrated over maps showing widening Allied penetration. Coastal strongpoints intended to delay attackers for hours were falling within minutes. Inland routes marked for armored counterattacks were already contested by airborne units. Every new report reduced the window of opportunity for an effective response. The staff knew what needed to be done. The doctrine for countering an amphibious assault was clear. What they lacked was permission, and until Hitler reversed his initial assessment, the German command system remained a network of prepared plans without the authority to act. When detailed situation reports finally reached Hitler, they described conditions no longer compatible with the idea of a diversion: airborne brigades holding road junctions, thousands of landing craft delivering continuous waves of troops, and strongpoints collapsing under naval fire. Yet he interpreted every development through the filter of the expected Calais landing. He argued that the Allies were trying to force Germany to commit reserves prematurely to him. The landings on the Norman coast represented an operational decoy meant to pull the armored divisions away from the real invasion corridor. His staff presented prisoner interrogations, radar records, and precise beach casualty estimates, but none of it shifted his position. Analysis was dismissed as incomplete. Losses on the coast were attributed to local weakness, not strategic threat. The deception campaign the Allies had constructed, dummy armies, false radio traffic, manipulated intelligence, had shaped his expectations so thoroughly that reality could not override perception. Reports mentioning paratroopers in depth were explained as sabotage groups. Heavy naval bombardment was treated as a show of force. Even the scale of the landing force was judged insufficient for a true invasion, despite exceeding every previous Allied operation. This conclusion stalled the only meaningful countermeasure available: a concentrated strike by armored divisions before the Allies secured their inland positions. Without tanks, the coastal infantry, static units manned by older soldiers, foreign conscripts, and troops lacking mobility, had no chance of pushing back the assault. Their role was merely to delay, not destroy, an invader. Field commanders continued sending increasingly urgent requests. Some insisted the beachheads were already expanding. Others reported that airborne units were securing bridges and blocking key roads the panzers would need. Messages included precise grid references showing that the Allies were creating corridors inland. Hitler rejected these interpretations, convinced that the Allies would not commit their main force to terrain. He considered unsuitable for a decisive breakthrough. By holding firmly to his belief, he prevented the redeployment of forces capable of altering the early stages of the battle. The German command system, highly structured, rigid, and engineered to execute only the Führer's intent, could not challenge his conclusion. Staff officers were bound to present information, not to contradict strategic assumptions. As hours passed, the window for effective intervention narrowed. The Allies unloaded artillery, tanks, engineering equipment, and vehicles. Supply lines began forming across the beaches. Temporary bridges and causeways were constructed. Every minute of delay strengthened the Allied position and weakened the possibility of a counterattack, powerful enough to drive them back into the sea. Hitler's stance did not merely slow the German response. It defined it. He believed the main blow was still coming. Therefore, every action had to be measured against the risk of committing too soon. This strategic hesitation, reinforced by the command structure beneath him, allowed the Allies to transform the initial landings into a stable, expanding foothold. As the scale of the Allied landings became undeniable across the divisional and corps levels, the German commands closest to the fighting tried to initiate the counterattack doctrine laid out years earlier. Strike the invasion force before it consolidated. The doctrine required immediate concentration of armored divisions, rapid movement toward the coast, and decisive engagement while the enemy was still unloading equipment on open beaches. But no formation could assemble at the necessary speed. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned between Caen and the coast, attempted repeatedly to move according to local assessments, yet each attempt encountered contradictory orders. Messages from higher headquarters alternated between permission to advance and directives to hold until Hitler issued a final decision. This stop-start cycle wasted the only advantage the division possessed: proximity to the landing zones. Units farther inland were immobilized by logistic constraints. Panzer Lehr, considered one of the most capable armored formations in the West, began preparing to move toward the beaches, but air superiority negated its mobility. Heavy Allied bombing had already cratered roads and rail lines, and Typhoon fighter bombers patrolled the Norman countryside. Columns attempting to advance risked destruction before reaching firing positions. Still, the greatest obstacle remained political. The authority to commit them was centralized above all field commands. Meanwhile, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division, trained intensively but inexperienced in large-scale combat, stood ready to launch an aggressive counterstroke. But Division-level orders required confirmation from Army Group headquarters, which required approval from OKW, which waited for Hitler. The layered chain of command transformed urgency into delay. Even when orders did arrive, they were partial or conditional. Advance to a midpoint, hold for reconnaissance, await further instruction. In the coastal sectors, infantry commanders radioed that they could not hold without armored support. They reported Allied tanks landing on multiple beaches, obstacles being cleared, and supply lines forming. They warned that Allied infantry were already pressing inland, threatening the junctions where German units could have concentrated. But without armor, their divisions were reduced to isolated pockets, fighting superior firepower. The Luftwaffe could not compensate. Fuel shortages and exhausted airfields limited sorties. Fighters that did reach the coast were intercepted by Allied air cover or forced to fly evasively under anti-aircraft fire. No sustained air attack could be mounted on the landing zones. The German air arm, once a core of Blitzkrieg, had become a marginal factor. Every passing hour benefited the Allies. Engineers built linkages between beaches, artillery units landed and established firing positions behind natural cover. The bocage terrain shielded troop movements while restricting German visibility. The one opportunity to strike the landing force in its vulnerable early hours was slipping away. Hitler's refusal to release the armored reserves in time created a strategic disconnect. Field commanders identified the urgency, staff officers prepared the plans, and divisions stood ready. Yet the system kept them paralyzed. The counterattack doctrine had relied on speed. The German response delivered hesitation. By the time Hitler accepted that the Normandy landings were not a diversion, the situation had already shifted beyond the point where a rapid counterblow could succeed. After hours of contradictory reports, silence from cut-off coastal batteries, and continuous updates on the scale of Allied ship concentrations, he finally acknowledged that the assault represented a major operation. Yet even in this moment, his focus remained divided between Normandy and the imagined threat at Pas-de-Calais. His first actionable directive still reflected hesitation. He ordered only part of the armored reserves to move, while keeping others in place to guard against the landing he believed was still coming in the northeast. This meant Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS were released too late and in insufficient strength to form a decisive combined punch. The armored groups that could have struck the beaches at dawn were now advancing against an enemy already fortified inland. Hitler's second major statement, recorded by several officers, revealed his strategic framing. If Normandy is the real invasion, the decisive moment is already past. It was an admission, not of defeat, but of lost opportunity. He recognized the significance of time, yet failed to act when time had mattered. His worldview, shaped by earlier victories and rigid belief in deception indicators, had prevented immediate action. As he received updated reports, his frustration shifted toward disbelief at the speed of Allied consolidation. Accounts of armored vehicles landing, airborne forces controlling key junctions, and naval fire preventing movement of German reserves conflicted with expectations formed by years of planning. Hitler questioned the accuracy of these reports, demanding verification from multiple sources, which consumed even more time. Orders issued during this phase reflected the tension between reality and preconceptions. He instructed that calm be held at all costs, designated the sector between Bayeux and Carentan as critical, and demanded that any breach be counterattacked immediately, but these directives reached commanders who lacked the mobility, strength, or coordination to execute them. Signals units struggled to relay messages through disrupted communications networks. Staff officers attempted to align multiple divisions whose positions were already compromised. Meanwhile, the Allies expanded their lodgment. Tanks rolled off landing craft in increasing numbers. Engineers established protected corridors through the bocage. Artillery units, once ashore, engaged German strongpoints with precision. Every factor strengthened the Allied foothold, while German forces waited for orders shaped more by strategic illusion than battlefield conditions. Hitler's late acceptance of Normandy as the main front did not produce a coherent strategic shift. Instead, it created a series of piecemeal responses, local counterattacks, fragmented movements, and defensive orders that arrived after positions had already been lost. His central role in decision-making, intended to ensure control, now ensured inefficiency. In effect, what he said and when he said it determined the tempo of the German reaction. The armored divisions finally moved, but not when they could change the outcome, only when they could delay it. As the scale of the battle unfolded inland, the core assumptions that had shaped German defensive planning collapsed one by one. The belief that the Atlantic Wall would hold long enough for reserves to mount a coordinated counterstrike proved unrealistic. Many strongpoints designed to delay an attacker for hours fell within minutes under naval bombardment and close-range infantry assaults reports reaching the higher commands. Describe bunkers collapsing from direct hits, machine gun nests isolated by smoke screens, and defensive minefields breached by engineers before reinforcements could intervene. The assumption of German mobility also failed. Panzer divisions, once the centerpiece of German operational doctrine, faced unprecedented levels of interdiction. Allied fighter bombers operated freely, destroying convoys, striking at crossroads and forcing columns to disperse or move at night. The few units that attempted daylight movement reported heavy losses before reaching assembly areas. Hitler continued to demand counterattacks, but underestimated how effectively Allied air power constrained movement. Communications deteriorated rapidly. Airborne operations behind the beaches severed telephone lines, captured relay stations, and disrupted road networks that staff officers had long deemed critical for moving armored units. Radio transmissions became unreliable due to jamming and overlapping requests for bandwidth. Hitler's directives often reached their recipients hours late, after conditions on the ground had already shifted. Another German assumption, that the Allies would take significant time to unload heavy equipment, proved incorrect. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, when they managed to penetrate the Allied air umbrella, reported tanks, artillery, and logistics vehicles already operational on shore. The Germans had expected days before mechanized units appeared in strength. Instead, Allied armor was pushing inland within hours. Hitler questioned these reports, believing they exaggerated Allied capability, but the pattern repeated across multiple beaches. Even the expected German reinforcement structure unraveled. Divisions designated for reserve roles were undermanned, under-equipped, or positioned too far from the landing zones. Many had been weakened by earlier transfers of experienced personnel to the Eastern Front. When Hitler demanded strong counterattacks, commanders struggled to explain that their forces lacked the manpower and equipment assumed in Berlin's planning documents inside Hitler's headquarters. Staff officers attempted to reconcile his directives with a shrinking list of viable options. He insisted on holding ground that had already fallen, reinforcing positions that no longer existed, and counterattacking along routes cut by airborne forces and naval gunfire. Field reports describing Allied penetration were viewed as incomplete or pessimistic. He reiterated that the main threat still lay elsewhere, even as the loss of key junctions pointed unmistakably toward a sustained operation in Normandy. The broader impact of Hitler's statements became visible across the front line. Divisions held in place instead of regrouping, armored units dispersed rather than concentrated, and operational instructions that shifted with each new fragment of information. The German defensive structure functioned as designed, waiting for central direction, but the central direction no longer matched battlefield reality. With each hour of delayed response, the Allied foothold deepened. The assumptions that had shaped German planning for years had collapsed, and the system built around them followed. As German forces attempted fragmented countermeasures, the Allied advance shifted from a precarious landing to an expanding operational system. The moment Hitler finally recognized Normandy as the decisive front, the conditions that could have allowed a successful counterattack no longer existed. What followed was not a clash of armies on equal footing, but a contest between a fluid, coordinated Allied structure and a rigid, delayed German response. Hitler demanded immediate counterattacks to throw the Allies back, but the terrain no longer allowed it. The Bocage country, dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, narrow fields, neutralized German mobility armor could not maneuver effectively, and infantry units attempting to advance were caught in kill zones by Allied artillery already established inland. Hitler insisted that divisions strike with determination, but commanders reported that every approach route was under observation or fire. He issued further orders reflecting a widening disconnect between expectation and capability. He ordered Caen to be held under all circumstances. Though reports showed Allied forces pressing on its outskirts with armored brigades, he demanded the severing of beach-to-inland connections. But the Allies had already secured multiple corridors, supported by continuous flows of supplies. He instructed that paratrooper-held junctions be retaken, unaware that many German battalions lacked the strength for sustained engagements. Hitler's frustration manifested in increasingly rigid directives. He prohibited withdrawals even from positions threatened with encirclement. He insisted on counterattacks across terrain where armored formations could not deploy. He required that every unit hold its ground until reinforced, but reinforcements repeatedly arrived too late or were intercepted en route. His belief that determination could compensate for structural disadvantage hardened into inflexible commands that cost formations. Their remaining mobility, Allied air dominance, amplified the consequences of these decisions. German columns moving to comply with directives suffered strikes from fighter bombers, equipped with rockets and cannons. Roads cratered by previous bombings slowed movement further. Messages Hitler issued from hours-old information produced orders that were almost impossible to fulfill under air threat commanders who hesitated risked reprimand. Those who obeyed risked annihilation. The turning point of the battle occurred not when the Allies broke inland, but when Hitler's refusal to adapt froze the German response system. His insistence that every movement require approval prevented local commanders from exploiting fleeting opportunities. His belief in the imminent Calais landing continued to tie down entire divisions, and his misinterpretation of Allied objectives led to the misallocation of critical reserves at the very moment they were needed most. By the end of the first day, the Allied foothold spanned multiple beaches, linked by defensive positions and supplied by an armada whose scale Germany had never previously faced. The window for a decisive German response, a counterattack that could strike before full consolidation, had closed completely. What Hitler said that day did not merely delay action, it redefined the course of the battle. His words locked the German system into a pattern of defensive paralysis that persisted long after the beaches were lost. When Hitler finally released the bulk of the armored reserves, the tactical conditions they needed no longer existed. The Allies had secured artillery positions inland, engineers had cleared exit routes from the beaches, and supply columns were already moving through protected corridors. The counterattack the German strategy relied on, fast, concentrated, and decisive, was now forced to operate against a prepared, well-supported, and rapidly expanding enemy. Panzer Lehr advanced first, but its movement demonstrated how much the battlefield had changed. The division, arguably the most well-equipped armored formation in the West, attempted to reach the front in broad daylight. Allied pilots spotted its columns almost immediately. Typhoons and thunderbolts struck convoys repeatedly, destroying vehicles, scattering marching infantry, and forcing temporary halts. Even when the division managed to regroup, It arrived with fewer tanks, fewer half-tracks, and depleted ammunition. Its combat effectiveness was diminished before it engaged a single Allied unit. The 12th SS tried to move simultaneously, but communication disruptions and blocked roads slowed its advance. Bridges had been destroyed, fields were saturated from recent rain, and bottlenecks formed behind civilian refugees and retreating German troops. Hitler demanded they reach specified positions immediately, but commanders reported that terrain and Allied air attacks made such movement physically impossible. Orders from above did not align with ground reality. The 21st Panzer Division, closest to the beaches, managed the only armored thrust of the day. It attacked between Juno and Sword, briefly pushing toward the coast. For a moment, it appeared that a breakthrough might occur, but Allied anti-tank guns, naval fire, and newly landed armor blunted the advance. The division lacked the mass and coordination to exploit the gap it created. As the assault stalled, Hitler demanded renewed attacks, unaware that the division had reached its limits. Meanwhile, infantry divisions intended to support these armored movements were fragmented. Some were pinned down by airborne units entrenched in key villages. Others were delayed by destroyed transport routes or lacked ammunition due to disrupted supply lines. Hitler's orders to strike immediately assumed coherent formations. Commanders on the ground were working with battle groups assembled from whatever troops remained. The failure of these counterattacks was not a result of poor tactical execution, but a product of timing. Hours mattered, and Hitler had allowed those hours to pass while insisting Normandy was a diversion. By the time he acknowledged the scale of the invasion, Allied engineering units were reinforcing causeways, artillery was establishing overlapping fire zones, and naval guns continued to deliver firepower unmatched by anything Germany could deploy. Even the most determined German units found themselves advancing into interlocking fields of fire. Every approach route was exposed. Every concentration of force drew immediate Allied attention. The Luftwaffe, reduced to scattered sorties, could not challenge the aircraft, destroying German momentum. Hitler issued more orders: hold positions, commit reserves, counterattack at once. But the divisions were arriving too weakened and too late to produce strategic effect. The moment in which a unified blow could have changed the balance had passed before his approval ever reached the front. What remained was not a counterstroke, but a series of isolated efforts, brave, costly, and ultimately insufficient against an invasion force already entrenched. As Allied forces deepened their foothold, German staff officers attempted to present updated assessments to Hitler, reports describing widening gaps, collapsing strongpoints, and the accelerating arrival of Allied armor inland. Each message indicated that the battle was moving beyond the stage where a counterattack could reverse the landings. Yet Hitler continued to interpret the situation through the lens of deception, insisting that the Allies had not yet committed their main strength. He argued that if the Allies truly intended Normandy to be decisive, they would have concentrated even larger forces there. He maintained that the greatest threat remained in the Pas-de-Calais region and refused to release units positioned to defend it. Divisions that could have reinforced Normandy were kept static, held in readiness for an attack that would never come. His fixation on a second, hypothetical landing prevented the redeployment of troops who might have slowed the Allied advance inland. Meanwhile, German commands near the beaches faced worsening conditions. Artillery positions were overrun or forced to retreat. Communications networks deteriorated further. Supply columns attempting to bring ammunition and fuel ran into ambushes or airstrikes. Pieces of divisions fought without contact with higher headquarters. Relying on local initiative rather than coordinated planning, officers repeatedly requested withdrawal to more defensible positions, but Hitler denied permission, insisting every meter be held. This rigidity compounded. The damaged units, unable to maneuver, were surrounded or destroyed. Terrain that might have been used to form new defensive lines was lost while divisions fought to hold untenable positions. The traditional German strength, flexibility in the face of shifting conditions, was replaced by a static defense dictated from above. Reports describing Allied control of key road junctions, the establishment of artillery belts, and the continuous flow of reinforcements were often delivered alongside Hitler's demands for immediate counterattacks. These demands grew more detached from the logistical and tactical limits confronting field commanders. Hitler insisted that the enemy must be driven back into the sea, even as officers informed him that the enemy was already kilometers inland, supported by artillery, tanks, and naval fire. His statements reflected not a tactical plan, but a refusal to acknowledge that the invasion had entered a new phase, one in which Germany no longer dictated the tempo of battle. The initiative had shifted irreversibly to the Allies. Their ability to supply, reinforce, and maneuver exceeded anything the Germans could match at this stage of the war. Inside German headquarters, officers understood that Hitler's reading of the battlefield was diverging from reality. They recorded that his decisions were increasingly based on preconceptions rather than report strategic logic. Withdraw to shorten lines, concentrate armor for a single strike, preserve mobile units for later stages, was softened or overridden by ideological insistence on holding ground and punishing disobedience. The result was a widening gulf between Hitler's view of the battle and the conditions on the ground. As the Allies linked their beachheads and strengthened their positions, German attempts to comply with his instructions became increasingly symbolic rather than effective. The division between command intent and battlefield capability had become absolute. The struggle in Normandy was no longer a test of force, concentration, or tactical ingenuity. It had become a demonstration of what happens when a centralized command system refuses to adapt while its enemy evolves every hour. By the time Hitler fully recognized that Normandy, not Pas-de-Calais, was the decisive front, the battle had already entered a phase Germany could not reverse. The Allied lodgment had grown into a continuous defensive perimeter supported by artillery, armor, and ceaseless logistical flow from the sea. Attempts to push the invaders back had been reduced to local actions lacking coordination, mobility, and sufficient firepower. What remained of German strength was committed piecemeal, consumed in isolated engagements that achieved tactical resistance without operational impact. Hitler continued issuing orders that referenced conditions no longer present. He demanded counterattacks from divisions that had been reduced to scattered battle groups. He instructed commanders to retake villages already fortified by Allied armor. He insisted on holding terrain that no longer held strategic value, forcing German units into static positions vulnerable to encirclement or annihilation. His directives reflected a belief that determination could offset weakened formations, disrupted supply lines, and overwhelming Allied superiority. The staff attempted to reconcile these orders with the shrinking pool of available forces. Reports described dwindling ammunition reserves, fuel shortages, and casualties that divisions could no longer replace columns. Moving to comply with Hitler's demands were struck repeatedly by Allied aircraft. Reinforcements meant to stabilize the front arrived depleted and immediately encountered enemy fire. The system designed to deliver precise, coordinated action now produced reactionary, fragmented responses. As the Allies pushed inland, capturing key ports and dominating the logistical network, the German strategic position deteriorated rapidly. Panzer divisions that survived the early fighting were forced into defensive roles unsuited to their design. Infantry divisions, holding extended lines under constant pressure, collapsed one after another. Efforts to rebuild a coherent front were overtaken by the pace of the Allied advance. Hitler's final statements about the invasion reflected a mix of recognition and denial. He acknowledged that the battle had turned against Germany, yet insisted that a decisive counterstroke was still possible if units held their ground. He refused to authorize strategic withdrawal, rejected proposals to consolidate forces, and ordered further attacks his commanders could not execute. The gap between his directives and the operational reality became unbridgeable. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of his decisions on D-Day became unmistakable. The Allies broke out of the Norman pocket, enveloped German forces in the Falaise region, and destroyed much of the remaining combat strength in the West. The failure to respond effectively on June 6 turned into a failure to defend France at all. The armored reserves, released too late, were ground down by attrition they were never meant to endure. Historians later identified this moment as one of the war's pivotal strategic failures, not because Hitler lacked information, but because he rejected the information he received. His belief in a Calais landing shaped decisions at the exact moment decisive action was required. A command system built around absolute authority magnified the effects of that belief. ensuring that hesitation at the top translated into paralysis across the entire Western Front. By the time German forces attempted to recover, the opportunity had vanished. The Allies had established a foothold that no counterattack could break, and the path to Paris lay open. One morning's misjudgment, multiplied through a rigid hierarchy, ensured that the outcome in Normandy would define the collapse that followed. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.